Okay, hi, thanks. My name's Ivan McKee, and I'm going to talk to you tonight about the economics of independence, why I think it makes sense for Scotland to be an independent country. But first of all, I want to tell you a bit about my journey to Yes, why I'm standing here today talking to you. My background's in manufacturing. I've worked for a lot of manufacturing companies over the years, and for the last 9 or 10 years I've been running my own businesses, manufacturing businesses in Scotland, England and also in Eastern Europe. And a couple of years ago, when the referendum came to be a live issue, I decided it would make sense to have a look at what it was all about, and did it make sense for me, for my family, and how would it affect my businesses. So what I did was have a look at the numbers round about the independence debate. I ignored all the spin, what the politicians were saying, went and had a look at the raw data, looked at it in fact as if it was a business. Would it make sense for me to invest in Scotland PLC? Would it be a good place to put your money, or was it a bit of a basket case, as we'd perhaps been led to believe over the decades? And what I found surprised me. It became very obvious to me very quickly that Scotland was very much a rich country, very much somewhere you would want to invest your money if you had the opportunity. Very contrary to what we've been led to believe over the years. I've been told Scotland was too wee, too poor to survive on its own. So what I want to do today is just take you through some of that information, make you aware of it, and hope you can make up your own mind on how to vote on the independence referendum in September. First of all, what I want to do though is talk a bit about why it is that business people find the idea of independence attractive. What is it about that's had thousands of business people coming forward, signing up to campaign in favour of independence in September? Well, it's very simple. When you're in business, what you do is you look at what works. And if you look at countries that work, what you find is that the most successful countries are countries like Scotland, small, independent, North European, West European countries of about 5 to 10 million people that have done very well in the world. Most of those countries with a lot less natural resources and opportunity than Scotland has. So that's what works. And the reason for that is because small countries have got shorter lines of communication and less bureaucracy. It's a bit like working in a big corporation where it takes forever to get anything done, very difficult to react to opportunities, very difficult to deal with problems. Small companies, by comparison, are much more fleet of foot, much more flexible and much more able to take advantage of opportunities. In fact, the most successful big companies are the ones that divide themselves up into small operating units that operate largely independently. And it's the same with countries. And business people understand that, entrepreneurs understand what that's all about. And it's all about self-determination, responsibility for your own actions. When business people start up their business, they often go through the process of being told it's too difficult, it's too much hard work, you'll have too many problems, you'll not be successful, don't even bother trying. And business people understand what it's like to go through that process, come out the other end and make a success of it. So it's all about self-determination, responsibility for your own actions, standing on your own 2 feet. We liken it very often to a management buyout. Now, management buyouts where the management of a division of a company take over the operation of that company from the large corporation are by far the most successful type of corporate restructuring deals. And the reasons for that are obvious. Management understands what it takes to make the business work. They've got skin in the game and they've got experience in that business, in that sector. And Scotland's very much like a management buyout. We've got a business that's fundamentally strong in all the right sectors. The problem we've got is we've had some bad strategy over the decades and of course some bad management at head office level. This is an opportunity for the people of Scotland to take over the management of the country and make a success of it, I've no doubt. So really when it comes down to it, the choice facing us and what business people understand is it's a choice between dependence and independence. And it's, when you put it like that, it's fairly obvious which one business people would choose. So let's have a look at the economic case. Let's have a look at the numbers. First point to note is that this is a rich country. Scotland generates more tax per person than the UK average. And that's a fact that not a lot of people necessarily understand or appreciate, and it's very important to get that message clearly stated. If you look at the numbers, let's look here at the last 5 years' data. In every one of those years, Scotland generated more tax than the UK. Over the last 5 years, the average has been £1,200 per person more in tax generated in Scotland than the UK average. That covers all taxes: income tax, VAT, national insurance, corporation tax, you name it, all added together. And last year wasn't a one-off. If you look back over the last 33 years that we've got the data available for, there's the graph, and you can see the dark line, the higher line there is the tax per person generated by Scotland, and the smaller line, the average tax per person in the UK. In some years, the tax generated in Scotland is an awful lot higher than that in the UK. In some years, just a bit higher. But in every year, it's higher, and that shows the fundamental strength of the Scottish economy. Another measure of wealth is GDP, gross domestic product. And again, if you look at GDP per person, Scotland has consistently had higher GDP per capita than the UK average. 11% higher last year, 18% higher the year before. In fact, if you completely exclude the North Sea, oil and gas from the picture, Scotland's GDP is the same as the UK average. So it's true to say that oil is very much the icing on the cake. It's a bonus. It allows us to do things and invest for the future, but it's very much not an essential part of Scotland's wealth. Even without the North Sea, Scotland is a rich country comparable to the rest of the UK. So then we need to look at the other side of the equation, the spend side. Now, almost every country in the Western world is running a deficit, spending more than it earns at the moment. That's been the case since the crash 6 years ago. In fact, the only country in the West at the moment that's in surplus is Norway, funnily enough. So it's important to compare Scotland to the rest of the UK. What's our deficit like compared to the UK? Well, again, there's the data for the last 5 years. And if you look back over those 5 years, you'll see that in 4 of those years, Scotland has had a lower deficit than the UK. And over that period, the UK has run a deficit of almost 6% of GDP, and Scotland just a touch over 4%. So Scotland demonstrates that it's got a lower deficit as well as a higher tax take. So on all those measures, a wealthier country than the rest of the UK. In fact, if Scotland had been an independent country on the last year, it would have been 14th richest in the industrialised world, compared to the UK at number 18. And again, looking back through history, Scotland's been higher up that league table than the UK in each one of the last 30 years. Interestingly, though, is to look at who the richest countries in the world are, and there's a list. And if you look down that, you'll see Luxembourg, Norway, Switzerland, Netherlands, Ireland, Austria, Sweden. Of those, all except 2 in the top rich list are small to medium-sized north-west European countries, like Scotland. In fact, most of those countries have got far less natural resources than Scotland, but they've managed to become richer than we are. And interestingly, the 2 on that list that aren't in that category, the USA and Australia, the thing they've got in common, of course, is that they both used to be ruled by London until they decided to become independent, and you don't see either of those wanting to go back under London rule anytime soon. So, don't take my word for it. Standard & Poor's report came out in February of this year. The Scottish economy is rich and relatively diversified, with a high GDP, $47,000 per head. Even excluding North Sea output and calculating per capita GDP, just looking at onshore income, Scotland would qualify for our highest economic assessment. So Standard & Poor's, a ratings agency, sees the value of an independent Scotland. And again, the IFS report came out towards the end of last year, looked at the data for 2011-12, and talked about the wealth of the Scottish economy. In that year, Scotland generated 9.9% of the UK government's revenues and only accounted for 9.3% of UK spend. So the gap between spending and revenue in Scotland, much healthier than that for the UK as a whole. So, if you look back over those last 5 years, for example, if Scotland had had the same amount spent on it in percentage terms that it generated in UK tax, Scotland would have had an extra £8.5 billion to spend. In other words, the independence dividend, that works out at £1,600 per person. A significant amount of money, as I say, that Scotland would have had to spend had we received the same percentage of UK spend as we generated in tax take. So let's look at a bit more detail on some of these numbers and something called allocated expenditure. If you look at the spend numbers for Scotland, where the GERS data comes from, A lot of that spend, we know what it is. We know in health, education, welfare, how much is spent in Scotland. But there's also quite a lot of spend there that's spent centrally in Westminster and is allocated to Scotland. And in Scotland's accounts, the numbers we've just looked at, that's done on the basis of a population share. There's a couple of problems with that. Because if you look at the two biggest areas of allocated expenditure, the first one is defence. Scotland is charged on those accounts £3.3 billion by the Westminster government for our share of UK MOD defence spending. The actual defence spending in Scotland is less than £2 billion, just about more than half of what we're charged. In actual fact, the defence budget for an independent Scotland has been costed at £2.5 billion, comparable with similar countries in terms of geography and size and defence needs, like, for example, Denmark, that also spends £2.5 billion. So straight away there, an independent Scotland could spend £800 million a year less on defence, have a very adequate defence force in comparison with our Scandinavian neighbours, for example, and still spend more on defence in Scotland and create more defence jobs in Scotland. And the second area of allocated spend is around about debt interest payments. GERS includes a £4.1 billion spend charge against Scotland for its population share of UK debt interest payments. The monster charge of £50 billion that the UK spends every year on interest payments on its £1.4 trillion worth of debt. So the question, of course, is, as we've shown that Scotland generates a lower deficit and would have a lower debt than the UK if independent, why do we get charged so much for the interest? And that's absolutely true. An independent Scotland would have a lower debt to GDP ratio, a lower deficit to GDP ratio than the rest of the UK, and as a consequence, that interest charge should be lower were Scotland an independent country. In fact, if you look back over the 33 years for which we have data, over those years, Scotland actually didn't generate any debt at all. And economists on both sides of the debate, unionists and pro-independence economists, have looked at this in a bit of detail. Scotland, in actual fact, had it been independent since 1980, would have run up a considerable surplus and would have had money in our oil fund in the same way that Norway has managed to do so. So let's take a minute to look at how much debt costs, because one of the things we get told is an independent Scotland would have to pay more for its borrowings than the UK does. Well, there's a chart of 10-year government bond yields, how much governments have to pay to borrow on the international money markets. And the interesting thing about that is if you look at the UK, they are 2.65% on the last data. There are some countries where it costs more to borrow than the UK, Spain, Italy, Portugal and Greece. No surprise there. But if you look at the long, long list of countries where it costs less, in many cases considerably less to borrow than it does in the UK, you see Switzerland, Denmark, Austria, Finland, Netherlands, Czech Republic, Sweden, Belgium, even France. So all of our neighbours and many other European countries have to pay less to borrow than the UK does. So the UK borrowing costs are nothing spectacular to write home about. In actual fact, even Ireland now has lower borrowing costs than the UK. So in all likelihood, Scotland's economy with its strength, as indicated by the Standard & Poor's report, its lower deficit and debt to GDP ratios, would in all likelihood have a lower borrowing cost than it does as part of the UK at the moment. So let's take a minute to talk about one of the scare stories that's been doing the rounds to do with the bank bailout. This goes along the lines of Scotland wouldn't have been able to bail out the banks had they crashed were Scotland independent. Now, to understand how this works, you've got to think about how banks work. If you've got a business and it goes bust, then it's a problem for you. But it's not a big problem for many other people. The world goes on and somebody else steps in and takes your place. If you're in a bank, however, and it gets into financial trouble, it's a problem. It's a problem for your customers, your savers, the borrowers, companies that do and have money saved with you. It's a problem for the whole economy because if a bank goes down, it causes a problem for the government and the whole economy. So that's why when banks are at risk, governments step in a way that they don't generally do when other businesses are in trouble. And if you look at what happened with the British banks during the recent banking crash, the US Fed, the United States Federal Reserve, stepped in and contributed almost $1 trillion, £640 billion, to the bailout of the UK banks. A large part of that, about half of that, went to Barclays, but RBS and HBOS also received numbers between 100 and 200 billion dollars. And the reason for that was quite simple, because all of those banks did an awful lot of their business in the US, and it was very important to the US government that those banks didn't go bust. Barclays, for example, was closely tied up in the whole Lehman Brothers situation. So then you look at some other examples around Europe. A couple of Belgian banks, Dexia and Fortis, who were tied up in the whole ABN AMRO situation that got RBS into trouble. When they went potentially into some trouble, they were bailed out by 4 countries, France, Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg, on the basis of how much business they did in each of those countries. And Belgium didn't have to pick up the tab on its own. And that's logical because, as I said, it's important for governments to stop banks crashing in their particular countries, and they step in to prevent that. The UK government also put money into the Irish banks, as you remember, although it was those banks were wholly owned in Ireland. They did business in the UK, and their crash would have caused problems for the UK economy. So the reality is, despite what we're told, that had Scotland been independent and had the banking crash occurred, and had Scotland had such lax regulation that caused that banking crash to occur, even if that had been the case, Scotland would have paid no more than its 10% share to the bank bailout, the proportion of business that was done in Scotland of those banks' total business that it did as part of the UK through the taxes we contribute to Westminster in any event. So let's move on and have a look at some charts that show where the UK's wealth comes from and where it ends up. First chart is a graph or a map of the richest parts of the UK. It shows where the wealth is generated within the UK. Basically, the darker the area, the higher the gross domestic product or national income that is generated in that part of the country. Now, as you would expect, south of England, south coast, City of London, along the M4 corridor, significant wealth generating areas. Northeast of Scotland, one of the wealthiest parts of the UK, and down across the central belt. Those are the parts of the country, the UK, that generate the most wealth. The second map shows where the wealth ends up. This is a chart of the wealthiest households in the UK, UK Office of National Statistics data, and this is a chart of households with more than £967,000 in total household wealth, including value of house, stocks and shares, bank accounts, pension funds, whatever, all added up together. And it's quite a stark picture. You'll see that the wealthiest households are in London and the south of England, and the further north you go, the less wealth the average household has. On the south coast of England, the average household, more than 13% of them have that level of wealth. In Scotland, it's less than 7%. So you look back at the first chart, and it shows you where the money comes from, and the second one shows you where it ends up, and that answers the paradox of why, if you look at the numbers, Scotland looks like a wealthy country, but when you walk around Scotland, it certainly doesn't in many places feel like that. Now, the next map is something that's kind of related to that. Money isn't everything, but this next map certainly is everything. This is average male life expectancy at birth by part of the UK. Again, the darker the colour, the lower the life expectancy. And what you'll see is that certain parts, Glasgow and the Western Isles, have a low life expectancy, 70 to 74 years. And as you move south through the country, life expectancy tends to get higher. And there's no surprise there, because it's very much a very close relationship between wealth of households and life expectancy. So really that's a social manifestation of the distribution of wealth across the UK. So in summary, to summarise this part of the overview, too poor, aye right. Don't believe what they tell you. This is a rich country. So it's the case that the data shows clearly that Scotland's wealthy. Why do we have so many people that stand up and tell us that this isn't the case? And the reality is, I'm afraid, that it's all down to, in many cases, self-interest. The Westminster MP gets a healthy salary, and people ask me what the job prospects would be in an independent Scotland. How many people would lose their jobs when Scotland became independent? And the answer is 59. the Westminster MPs would no longer have their comfy career path there. So really, just to summarise that, a nice wee quote: "It's hard to get somebody to understand something when their salary depends on them not understanding it," which sort of summarises the position of many of the people you see on the television trying to tell us that Scotland is too poor to go it alone. So let's have a wee look back in history at some of the scare stories we've had over the years, and what substance has been to them. And the first one is going back to 1979. Some of you may remember that. Many of you have no idea what I'm talking about. I can just about remember 1979. And this is a quote from the Daily Express, February of 1979, just before the referendum on the setting up of the Scottish Assembly in that year. Now, for various reasons, the referendum had a majority yes vote, but because of some hurdles put in the way, the referendum, the Assembly, was actually never enacted. But the quote's quite illuminating because it talks about Scotland's industrial base at that time, the coal mines, Ravenscraig, Linwood, Bathgate, Dounreay, and these would be allegedly under threat had Scotland the audacity to vote for its own assembly in 1979. The reality, of course, is anyone who understands Scotland's industrial history will know all of that industrial base was destroyed through the 1980s when there was no Scottish Assembly in place. So that's one of the oldest scare stories we can see. And if you look forward to the referendum in the 1990s for devolution, at that time both Standard Life and Scottish Widows said that they would leave Scotland were Scotland to vote for devolution. Of course, we did vote for devolution and we set up a Scottish Parliament in 1999. And guess what? Standard Life and Scottish Widows are both still here. No surprise there. So we really need to take with a pinch of salt some of the things we're told by certain companies at this stage of the independence referendum about what may happen or what they may decide to do if we vote yes. Learn from history. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. It's the third time of asking. Let's not be fooled again. Let's have a look at inward investment. When the independence referendum came along 2 years ago, people said that the long campaign and the fact we're going to be discussing independence for 2 years would lead to a reduction in inward investment. Companies wouldn't want to invest here because they'd be worried about what was going to happen in terms of the referendum. Well, again, the history shows something quite different. If you look back over those last 2 years, inward investment into Scotland has in fact flourished despite the referendum. And if you look back at the Ernst & Young report that came out at the end of 2013, after London, Scotland saw the highest level of inward investment in the UK, an increase on previous year. In fact, inward investment to Scotland has not been deterred by the prospect of the referendum. In fact, the opposite. So another scare story about what could have happened to inward investment in Scotland has been debunked. And there's some graphs of recently independent countries over the last 20 years and the upkick in inward investment they have experienced. So it's not unusual for newly independent countries to see a significant increase in inward investment because international business recognises the opportunity that accompanies a country taking control of its own resources, its own destiny, and driving forward onto the world stage. So another example of one of the benefits that can flow. This is a chart of connectivity, air passenger numbers going into 3 countries, the capital cities of Denmark, of Norway, and of Scotland, all with a population about 5 million. Significantly more air passenger traffic going through Copenhagen or Oslo, 1.5 times as much, in fact, in each of those cities than there is going through Glasgow and Edinburgh combined. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is to do, of course, with air passenger duty that significantly reduces the amount of traffic going through our airports. And the second, of course, is the fact that those are both proper capital cities of independent countries and not sit in a regional backwater of a different country. So it's a clear example of the increase in tourism and business activity that can accrue to an independent country of about 5 million people. And let's talk about pensions, another scare story. Here's a headline from the Daily Telegraph, again towards the end of 2013. Only Mexicans have a worse state pension than the British. Of the 40 OECD countries, they looked at pensions relative to cost of living, and the UK was number 39 on that list. The UK pension is nothing to write home about. If you look right across Europe, it's one of the worst pensions that exists. So frankly, talking about the UK pension is something that's a wonderful benefit of the union, frankly doesn't hold water. In fact, pensions are more affordable in an independent Scotland. If you look at how much Scotland currently spends on social protection, which is welfare and pensions combined, it's a lower percentage of government revenue and a lower percentage of gross domestic product in Scotland than it is currently in the UK. So let's move on to the next subject, the subject of oil. We're told that Scotland couldn't be independent because the oil's running out, and the oil pays for everything. And as we've shown already, oil is a part of the Scottish economy, but it's by no means all that there is to the Scottish economy. And Standard & Poor's were quite clear that even without revenues from the North Sea, Scotland was a very viable and rich economy. Oil revenues represent about 15% of Scotland's economy. It's a lower percentage than Norway, which comes in at about 25 to 30%. And having excessive revenues from the North Sea isn't something that's been a problem for Norway. In fact, a growing, increasingly large part of Scotland's revenues for the oil industry are the skills and expertise that we've built up over the decades that we now export around the globe. Estimates of how much oil is left vary between 16 and 24 billion barrels, 1 to 1.5 trillion pounds in value, before taking into account the impact of a new technology or indeed new fields yet to be explored. In a minute, we'll compare the Scottish oil industry to something else at a UK level. But first, let's have a wee look at some data points round about the current state of the investment into the North Sea oil industry. 38,000 new jobs, new oil and gas jobs over the next 5 years. That's the estimate from the Bank of Scotland as to the growth prospects of the oil industry going forward. And there's been an 80% increase in planning applications in Aberdeen over the last 12 months as businesses look to expand in that sector, and the building work that accompanies that. If you look at new office blocks being built, and if you look at the amount of investment, 14 billion investment in the last 12 months in the North Sea oil sector from a range of companies. That certainly doesn't look like the actions of an industry that's planning to leave or seize the oil running out anytime soon. And let's look at the UK economy. If oil is the biggest sector at 15% of the UK of Scotland's economy, in the UK, financial services sector is the biggest part of the UK's economy, comprising almost 12% of UK tax revenues in 2012-13. So the question is, which of those sectors would you rather have as your largest sector? An oil sector where we've got physical resources there for decades and decades to come, or a financial services sector that can be moved anywhere in the world at short notice? We're always told we have to treat the bankers well, or else they might go and live and work somewhere else. So that's a fine example of what the UK economy is built on. So in other words, what would you rather have in your back garden, a gold mine or a casino? And you got to remember, the guy down the street can always open a casino. The world financial sectors in Singapore, Shanghai, Frankfurt, chasing after the business that London currently enjoys as a world financial sector, and it could move very, very easily. A much more uncertain future, you'll agree, than the Scottish oil industry. And the final scare story: Go It Alone Scotland faces threats from outer space. Defence Secretary Phil Hammond talking not a few weeks ago, from the ridiculous to the sublime, or the other way around. Okay, so to finish off, I want to talk you through a wee story from our neighbour across the sea, Norway. And it's a story about the Prime Minister of Norway, who was walking along the fjord one day, and he came along the magic lamp, and he picks up the magic lamp and gives it a rubber. Out pops the genie, and the genie says to the Prime Minister of Norway, I'll give you some wishes to make Norway a better place. And the Prime Minister says, well, that's a bit difficult because Norway is one of the richest countries in the world. Where we measure these things, it's one of the happiest countries in the world. There's not much poverty. Everybody's got a good job and plenty of time to enjoy their leisure time and the money to do so. It's difficult to think of something that could make Norway a better place. And the genie says, well, you need to think of something. So after a few minutes, the Prime Minister says, I've thought of a few things. And he says, well, on you go. He says, well, we've got a great economy, but it's built on narrow foundations, the oil industry, fisheries, and one or two other things. It would be great if we had a bit of a broader base to our economy. For example, we've got this national drink called Aquavit that we love, but nobody's ever heard of it. It'd be great if that was a world-renowned brand that people from Singapore to Chicago would pay stupid money to take off our hands, and only we could make it, and we couldn't make enough of it. And that'd be a great industry to have. That would help our economy going forward into the future. He says, yeah, we can do that. He said, we've got a problem with our language. We speak Norwegian and nobody else in the world speaks Norwegian. If we want to go and do business anywhere else, we need to learn another language. If we want to go on holidays, even that's annoying because nobody understands Norwegian. It'd be great if Norwegian was a world business language. Anywhere we went in the world, from Japan to Brazil, everybody understood Norwegian and we didn't have to bother learning another language. That would help. Yeah, we can do that as well. He said we've got a beautiful country here, but it's big. The infrastructure is expensive to put in place. It's there's mountains all up and down the country. It's a huge distance from top to bottom. The weather's horrible in the winter. Minus 35 for a few months of the year. We've got the snow ploughs out having to dig our way through the snow. It'd be great if we had the same natural resources and the same population in a country that was a quarter the size. That'd make life a lot easier. He said, yeah, we can manage that as well. He said we've got a problem getting to our main markets in Europe. We've got to go through 2 other countries to get there. It's a bit of a nuisance. It would be great if we had a landmass stuck on our southern border of 60 million people who all spoke Norwegian and were dying to buy our energy and our drink and our oil. We wouldn't want to be ruled by them, but we want them as our neighbours that we could trade with. That would make commerce a bit easier for us as well. Said yeah, we can manage that. He said it'd be great if we had 4 of the top 100 universities in the world. It'd be great if we had industrial heritage going back 150 years, that people respected their engineers for all the things they'd invented and our technology. It'd be great if we had a stronger brand. It'd be great if our national poet was celebrated every year from Russia to America, and it'd be great with a national dress that everybody instantly recognised. That would do wonders for our tourism, amongst other things. And the genie says, yeah, you can have all of that. And the whole point, of course, is that the No campaign laugh at us when we talk about Norway as being something we could aspire to be as rich as Norway. You've got to remember that in 1970, Norway was poorer than Scotland, and when you look at it, the number of advantages that we've got over Norway are quite considerable. The opportunities there to make this one of the best, richest countries in the world. All the ingredients are there. The only thing that's missing is people voting yes in September and then making this happen. Thanks very much.